Hola a todos, bienvenidos. Esta es la última presentación de este semestre de nuestra serie de presentaciones en el Centro Latinoamericano de Estudios Latinoamericanos y de la Frontera, CLABS, en NMSU. Un par de minutos vamos a dar para que siga entrando la gente y luego comenzamos. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Wait for us for a few minutes. We are letting people trickle in, and then we will begin our last speaker series presentation for the semester, actually for the whole academic year here at the Center for Latin American and Border Studies class. So sit tight. We'll begin in probably a minute or two. Okay, so welcome everyone, bienvenidos todos. My name is David Ortiz. I am the faculty fellow for the Center for Latin American and Border Studies CLABS here at NMSU. Bienvenidos todos, soy David Ortiz, el faculty fellow del Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos y de la Frontera CLABS aquí en NMSU, New Mexico State University. Esta es la última presentación que tenemos, cerramos con broche de oro de nuestro Speaker Series, de nuestra serie de conferencias anuales. Y tenemos, por supuesto, dos excelentes presentaciones hoy. Así que bienvenidos a todos. El día de hoy vamos a hablar sobre el Zapatismo. Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about Zapatismo and its long history. So you are in for a fantastic time today. Without further ado, what I will do is I will present our two speakers for the day, and then I will actually leave them to speak. And what we will do is at the end, we will actually have time for your questions from the audience. On that note, a couple of things to note before we begin. You will see a Q&A button either at the bottom of your screen if you're on a PC, or at the top of your screen if you are on a Mac. And that Q&A button is the one that you want to use to pose questions to our speakers today. You can pose them at any time. Please don't wait till the end. We're happy to start fielding your questions at any time. We will reserve them till the end, but if you do them while they're speaking, not only it's easier for you to remember what you wanted to ask, but it's also better for us because we start ordering the questions as they come. So please use that Q&A button early and use it often too, as often as you want to. Also, another important announcement in the chat. What you will see is all of our social media accounts, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and X. And you can follow us there in all of them. And we will let you know what our next speaker series will be next year, next academic year. So if you just follow us online, basically you'll be updated as early as possible of who our next slate of presentations for next academic year will be. And we have been working really hard on it. The committee for CLABS that is dedicated to finding our speakers every year has already met. And actually, we have a really great slate for you next year. So please follow us on social media. Okay, so that being said, and without further ado, let me do presentations for our two really excellent speakers today, and I thank you both for being here. I'll start with Dr. Mariana Mora. Dr. Mariana Mora is Associate Professor at CIESAS, the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social in Mexico City. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin and an MA in Latin American Studies from Stanford University. Her research focuses on struggles against violence and the continued process of colonization as part of state formation in Latin America, and her scholarship is situated within critical race theories, gender studies, decoloniality, and the political. She is author of the book Kuxlejal, Politics, Indigenous Autonomy, Race, and Decolonial Research in Zapatista Communities, that came out in 2018. Her recent scholarship centers on struggles for justice against racialized forms of violence and territorial dispossession. She's part of the Continental Anti-Racist Action Research Network, or la Red de Investigación Acción Antirracista, the Collective to Eliminate Racism Mexico, or COPERA, and the Decolonial Feminist Network in Mexico. I might add that Mariana has been historically now for many, many years, an incredible advocate for human rights in Chiapas and indigenous rights in Chiapas. So it's our honor to have her here. Welcome, Dr. Mora.
Thank you very much, David.
So I'll next introduce Dr. Neil Harvey. Dr. Harvey is professor and head of the Department of Government at New Mexico State University. He earned his MA and PhD in government with a concentration in Latin American politics from the University of Essex in England. He has been a visiting researcher at the Center for Research and Advanced Studies in Social Anthropology, or the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social, CIESAS, in Chiapas, and at UNAM in Mexico City. His research focuses on rural protest movements in Mexico, particularly the origins and subsequent development of the Zapatista movement in Chiapas. He has published widely in English and Spanish on politics of Mexico, Zapatismo, indigenous rights, including the book The Chiapas Rebellion, The Struggle for Land and Democracy, published in 1998 by Duke University Press. He is currently researching the importance of land and agrobiodiversity for the Zapatista project Autonomy. He also co-directs the National Science Foundation Research Experience for Undergraduates, or an NSF-REU, here at NMSU. It's a collaborative side program on immigration policy and US-Mexico border communities. And again, I will add, Dr. Harvey has also been working for many, many years on Zapatista communities, Zapatista and indigenous rights in Chiapas. So welcome, Dr. Harvey. It's an honor having you both here.
Thank you, David. Muchas gracias. Y saludos, Mariana. Dr. Mora.
Great. Thank you both for being here. It's an honor for us to have you both here. Two incredibly accomplished, and not only that, but incredible advocates for indigenous rights in Chiapas and the Zapatista community, autonomous communities in Chiapas, with a long history of not only research, but embeddedness in those communities. So thank you. We appreciate it. I've talked to our speakers today, and the way that we will proceed for those of you who are in our audience is Dr. Harvey will begin by giving us kind of a historical overview of the Zapatista movement. Then Dr. Mariana Mora will take over and talk about her latest research. And after that, Dr. Harvey will continue and close for us with his latest research. After that, we will open up the Zoom for questions. So without further ado, Dr. Harvey, I leave our audience in your very capable presentation skills.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Martha, for the organization of this speaker series and today's presentation. As you can see, we want to mark 30 years of Zapatista struggle and resistance. And there have been several initiatives in Mexico and internationally over the past year or so to commemorate and to celebrate really and the sustainability of the Zapatista movement. So our presentation, I think, is good timing to reflect on what has been occurring over those decades, and particularly some of the more recent events which may not be so well known outside of Mexico. So thank you, everybody, for being here today. And I will begin with a little bit of a historical background, realizing that not everybody will be so familiar with what the Zapatista movement is about or how it came about 30 years ago. Before I hand over to Dr. Mora, who will talk on particular issues related to the movement and its autonomy and coming up to date. And then she will hand it back to me for some reflections on the relationship between indigenous communities and land and where the Zapatista movement is today. So I'm going to share a brief PowerPoint with some images to give folks an idea of this movement and why it's so important to know about. So hopefully you can all see that. One of the things that brings Dr. Mora and myself together also is the fact that in the latter part of 2023, we were both invited, along with other researchers and activists, to write fairly short pieces for a special issue of the Revista de la Universidad de México. This is the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the UNAM, publishes each month a special issue on various key topics. And so they made sure to also mark the 30th anniversary of the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas with a collection of essays. And the website is there. I won't go to it right now for the sake of time, but I just wanted to bring that to people's attention. And by the way, this PowerPoint and the references in it, we're happy to share with anybody at the end of the session today. So on some historical background, I think it's quite important to know that anyone who studies Mexico or Latin America, for that part, will know how central land conflicts have been to the political, economic, and cultural histories of the region. And the case that we're concerned with here is when we use the term Zapatista, that is referring to a particular individual, Emiliano Zapata, who was one of the main revolutionaries of the 1917 armed revolution in Mexico, which ended a very authoritarian regime that had existed since 1876 under Porfirio Diaz. That regime under Diaz had pushed Mexico to really integrate into the world capitalist economy and to convert landholding mainly for commercial products for export. It often meant that poorer peasants and small farmers were pushed off their land or had their lands taken over by those larger economic forces that the Diaz regime supported for all that time from 1876 until the 1910s, when the revolution really put an end to that. There's a lot of discontent, and one of the leaders, Emiliano Zapata, is still somewhat seen as a key figure in that transformation in Mexico, and the idea that land reform could be a way in which Mexico could achieve greater equality and justice, particularly in the rural sector. After the revolution, a new political party came to power in Mexico, the Revolutionary Institutional Party, or PRI. And what they did was to try and co-opt many of those goals of Zapata and the revolutionaries by giving the authority to the state to intervene in land mediation or conflict mediation over land struggles. But what it ended up doing was to provide more support to that political party and its president and its leaders than to actually carry out the promises of land reform. The way that political scientists have spoken about this is in terms of corporatist strategies. Corporatist in the sense not of business corporations, but in the sense that interest groups such as small farmers would be organized in a form of group or association that would be targeted by the government as the only organization that could ever have any kind of negotiation with the government. Anything outside, particularly those who were critical of the government, were often targeted for repression or simply marginalization of their voices. So the ruling party in Mexico is very effective in using both co-optation and repression to maintain political control over the country until things started to break down in the 70s and 1980s. Many communities protested against this top-down control from the Mexican state that had emerged from the revolutionary years. And the 1970s was particularly rife with social movements up and down the country, forming new independent organizations that said, we want access to land and land reform without the obligation to support one political party, and with the freedom to decide on the kind of development we want to occur within our lands. This was particularly important for social movements in the 1980s, particularly for indigenous peoples who also felt that they had been marginalized by the government ever since the end of the revolutionary period in the 1910s. There's a lot of scholarship and writing on social movements and political change in the world, in different countries, in comparative politics, in Latin America and in Mexico. The 1980s and 1990s particularly saw a lot of upsurge and interest in studying how social movements contributed to an opening in Mexico, not from the political parties or from legislature or from the top of the political system, but what we might say democratization from below, in which people from the working class or from the rural sector organized independently of those state-governed institutions, the corporatist institutions that have been so powerful from the 1930s onwards. And within that, within the state of Chiapas, which is one of Mexico's poorest states in the far south bordering Guatemala, there were several social movements in the rural areas that formed in the 1980s and really contributed to, I think, the ability of the uprising that would occur in 1994 to gain support and consolidate itself. Amongst some of those demands that fed into the Zapatista uprising of January the 1st, 1994, I think two things stood out from most people who've analyzed this. On the one hand, changes in public policy, which ended this government's commitment to land reform and the redistribution of land to poor peasants, which had been in place constitutionally since 1917. That was formally brought to a close in 1992. And what it did was to close off legal access to land redistribution for poor landless peasants and a new generation of younger people in rural communities in Chiapas. On the other hand, from below, by the early 1990s, we'd seen the organization of several social movements, which were now very vocal and active outside of the official channels of the ruling party and its corporatist organizations, which have been meant to kind of control popular discontent. So from the top, there were these reforms which antagonized much of the rural population, and from below, there was already the sense that organizations could take the initiative and contest these policies. The Zapatista uprising itself occurred on January the 1st, 1994, and involved around 3,000 indigenous people from the highlands and eastern part of the state. And on January the 1st of that year, 6 towns were taken over by Zapatistas. There was a brief period of armed conflict with the Mexican military, which lasted 12 days before a ceasefire was declared. And both sides then moved to peaceful negotiations, which went on and off for a few years. And we may get more into that later in the presentation. But I think it's really vital to note that the armed phase of this conflict only lasted 12 days, at least in this more open armed conflict. There's been a long history since of what we might call low-intensity warfare or counterinsurgency efforts to try and wear down the Zapatistas, which has had its impact in communities. But as we know, the Zapatista movement continues today with new initiatives. And one of those initiatives is that the Zapatistas felt that one of the main problems in rural Mexico, including in Chiapas, was the control exercised by outside political leaders that were not elected democratically from the communities themselves. They felt that these outside political leaders often imposed development projects which went against the needs and aspirations of the community members themselves, and particularly their own cultural traditions and goals to preserve and in some cases recuperate important aspects of those customs and traditions, including language, for example, in the education system. So the Zapatistas have, since 1994, created autonomous communities in which they elect their own leaders, their own representatives. They are rotated continuously, which allow for greater participation from community members in the running of day-to-day life. And those local community level structures have been scaled up into municipalities and even regional level autonomous governments. And we'll get more into the intricacies of that later in the presentation, I'm sure. But I wanted to make sure that people know that the Zapatistas, since the early days of 1994, is a movement that has used peaceful means of pressure, of mobilization, of alliance building within and beyond Mexico's borders, and at the local level have not only opposed the imposition of unpopular policies, but have steadily built alternatives to those policies in actuality rather than purely in theory or in argument. This picture is of Emiliano Zapata, who I mentioned at the beginning. I thought it's important that people know the reference to him because of the name. When we talk about Zapatistas today, and we're talking about the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which staged the uprising in 1994, the EZLN in Spanish, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. And they take this name from Zapata from the 1910s. This is Emiliano Zapata with a banner with one of his famous slogans for land and liberty, or tierra y libertad. And this is a mural from one of the current government officers of the Zapatistas in one of their autonomous communities. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that little background was helpful. We can, of course, in the Q&A, try and address any questions, but I'm going to hand over at this point to Dr. Mora to continue our joint presentation. Dr. Mora.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harvey. I will now I want to pick up where we left off, and to first ask maybe a very basic question. Why are we so interested in having in this webinar today a conversation of an uprising that began 30 years ago and that started being cultivated 40 years ago when the rebel army was founded? We could think about it as an exercise of trying to understand the past, or of teaching new generations of a movement that is of the last century. Or it could even become something that's sort of a nostalgia, the type of a movement that emerged, that has had profound transcendence and resonated for social movements, not only throughout Latin America, but I would say throughout the world. And instead of going that route, not that history isn't important, and history is fundamental, I'd like to think about the grandness of social movements for a moment, and that movements of the magnitude of the Zapatista movement, of the Zapatista National Liberation Front, and its Mayan, Celtal, Tzotzil, Tojolabal, and Chol, communities that are support communities, that are the support bases, that are civilian communities that support the rebel army. That type of social movement has had the ability not just the Zapatistas, but other movements, I would say, of that same stature, has the ability. I'm sorry, I'm in a cafe and an alarm is just going by. I'm hoping I don't know if you can hear that, but I think it ended. Has had the ability of operating on two simultaneous temporalities, no? A social movement emerges to face and confront and challenge the historical conditions that give it life, no? And at the same time, it has the possibility of transcending those very same historical conditions to resonate beyond temporalities and beyond geographies. That is to say that a movement that happened, in this case, 30 years ago, but we can think of other movements of 100, 150, 200 years ago, have the ability to continue to resonate beyond the temporalities from which they emerged. And if that's the case, then a movement like the Zapatista movement is offering us key political questions and reflections and possibilities of strategic collective action in the present. And that's the importance of understanding its genealogy, its trajectory, you know? And I would say that that's the case of what has joined us here today. So I'd like to start from that present. That present, I don't think, has anything to do with when the rebel army was formed as a political military organization of Marxist-Leninist tendencies, then reformulated through Mayan epistemologies and ontologies. I don't think that when they rose up in 1994, their first proclamation was that NAFTA and the free trade agreements meant death to indigenous peoples. You know? I don't think that they imagined, or certainly I didn't, I don't know if you knew, but I didn't imagine the type of death machines and the intensification of dispossession and of social and biological death brought on by narco state violence in the country, 30 years later. So we're in a very different political moment. When the Zapatistas rose up and they began to have peace talks about a year and a half after the uprising, between a year and a half, 2 years after the uprising, they chose to have the first round of peace negotiations centering on indigenous rights and culture. So if you think of the history of Marxist-Leninist political military organizations, anything that is not class exclusively in a very reductionist mode, class-based, is sort of a secondary priority, First is class-based demands, and then maybe women's demands, such as in the case of Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan Revolution, or indigenous peoples as an add-on to the heart of class-based struggle. But in this case, the Zapatista National Liberation Army, they have the first round of peace accords has to be on indigenous rights and culture. And I think it's very central. There's very few political military organizations in Latin America that put indigenous rights and indigenous claims, and hence a reflection on the ongoing effects of colonialization at the forefront of debates with the Mexican state. So in that moment, what the message by the EZLN to the Mexican state and Mexican society and to the world was that we can't transform profoundly the Mexican state if we're not unraveling its colonial underpinnings, And so the first point of departure is how you engage Mexican state with us as indigenous peoples. Thinking about the history of territorial dispossession, the history of sexualized violence, the history of we as indigenous people have been located in Mexican society in the niche of servitude, Our lives are designed to be, or are pushed to be, for the benefit of other people's lives. So if that's a central element of the EZLN uprising, the current moment of narco state violence adds a whole series of other layers to what we understand as territorial dispossession. The dispute between organized crime in the Mexican state and between organized crime that is currently going on in Chiapas is increasing forced displacement of indigenous communities in the highlands of the state, in the jungle regions of the Lacanon jungle. It's led to a lot of assassinations. It's led to forced disappearances. There's been an increase in Chiapas in cases of feminicide. I think it's important to remember that Mexico has, on average, 10 women and children a day are victims of feminicide. So that's the level of violence that we're living in this current moment. And the Zapatista movement then is resonating, it's speaking to, it's trying to transcend these historical conditions, even though it was another moment of against neoliberalism and the free trade agreements that were the impetus for its emergence. So in this historical context, the territories of the rebel army and its support bases, again, they're Tzotzil, Tzeltal, Tojolabal, and Chol, Mayan peasants in the majority. And in the first part of the uprising, it was roughly around the third of the state of Chiapas was under the influence of the Zapatista National Liberation Army. And its claims on the ground are saying autonomy is the way that we are demanding that the Mexican state transform its relationship to us. So autonomy, self-determination, self-governance, their own health institutions, agroecological institutions, agrarian reform institutions, justice institutions at the margins of the state. So they reject any state subsidies or public policies or social programs. By creating that form of autonomy, you're obligating the state to transform how it engages with you. So there's a moment, and that process of autonomy would be sort of the imagination of other worlds possible embodied in Mayan Zapatista communities in their everyday. So it's rather than waiting for the state to change, it's making those changes themselves, and that obligates state institutions to alter how they engage with, in this case, Mayan indigenous communities. So in the first moments of the Zapatista uprising, that claim to autonomy is very much very assertive. You declare war on the Mexican state. You demand a novel way of having peace accords where you put indigenous rights and hence decolonization at the forefront of any engagement with the state. And then rather than waiting for constitutional reforms or policy reforms and new social programs, you start to implement on the ground that which you are demanding through a context of autonomy. That's a very assertive stance. And that was, I think, the meaning of autonomy in indigenous regions in Zapatista territory up until the narco state violence started to alter profoundly historical conditions since 2006. But in the state of Chiapas, 2006 in most of the country, especially the north, and I would say in the last 10 years in the state of Chiapas. So that has meant the disputes between organized crime, the continued and increasing militarization by the Mexican state, the mega development projects such as the Train Maya that's through all of the southeast of Mexico, that's very destructive to indigenous territories. That has profoundly altered historical conditions. And that means that autonomy now, rather than just being an assertive stance, it forces the state to alter its being, is a defensive, protective stance of the protection and the defense of community life and community well-being. So I'd like to reflect on how does that shift, how to understand that shift in the sense of autonomy, how to understand that shift in the trajectory of autonomy in Zapatista territory, and how does that lead us to ponder other political questions. Neil, can you remind me how much time I have to have? About 6 minutes? Yes? Okay. So I'd like to start with these series of reflections by thinking about autonomy. We tend to think of autonomy as self-determination as the primary impetus to be the self-governing bodies based on the cosmovisions, on the culture, on the ways of being and knowledge of native societies. And rather than taking self-governing, what are the systems of authority, the way decisions are made as the first point of departure, I'd like to think rather how autonomy, first and foremost, passes through the milpa, through the cornfield, through that which sustains and grants sustenance to communities throughout Mesoamerica and has a particular political meaning in Zapatista communities. So if you think of the way that Zapatista autonomy unfolded, the lands that are now under Zapatista territorial control used to be of Ladino estate owners that had coffee, that had coffee, they had coffee fields, they had cattle pasture. And they took those lands, and then they created new communities onto those lands. So the first question is, well, how are we going to work these lands? How are we going to cultivate the land? The lands were profoundly depleted after decades of cattle stomping on the ground and rendering that soil virtually unfertile. No, so we need to recuperate the nutrients of the soil in such a way that we can have the cornfield. Again, we can have our corn, we can have our beans, we can have the multiple vegetables that grow in the milpa. And is that was the key moment for autonomy. So thinking about how to re-establish a connection to the earth, to the land, how to replete the soil, how to create conditions that we can ensure a subsistence, life existence as communities. That's the first impetus. And that generates then all of the other types of political questions and political agreements. Now, how are we going to make decisions on how we're going to work the soil, the earth, how we're going to cultivate, not produce, how we're going to cultivate the earth, how we're going to regenerate the forests that were depleted and were cut down. How are we going to have private ownership? Are we going to have community ownership, or perhaps, which is a decision that was made, no ownership? No, so communal lands in Zapatista territories don't have collective property titles, and certainly not individual property titles. It's the relationship to the land is through the working of the land, through taking care of the earth. If that's the main discussion that generates political decisions and grants meaning on who's the authority and what's the relationship to the collective, then that sparks a whole series of other reflections. How do we think of health? No, if political decisions of autonomy pass through the cornfield, pass through the way that we can cultivate the earth and reestablish a healthy relationship to the earth, then what does that mean in terms of how we understand health? And how does the health institution of autonomy, so the health commissions, how does that affect how we understand illness? Or health is not an absence of illness, but rather it's ensuring a balanced well-being between people's and individual bodies and in a relationship to earth. So that means we need to have health programs in autonomy in relationship to agroecology programs, and how we're going to make sure that there isn't fertilizers or that we're not using chemicals, because that affects this collective health. And if that's the central element, then what about knowledge? How are we going to think about the education system? The knowledge is what we know from the cornfields, it's what we know from the forest. That's the memory of our ancestors. And that's the point of departure to creating an education system. So what I want to do in the 2 minutes I have left is trying to understand that all of that is the impetus for autonomy, and all of that generates conditions, or it's an attempt to generate conditions to sustain a collective life existence. No, so it's central to caretaking roles, but caretaking roles not in the way that feminists have tend to think of caretaking roles as reduced to the domestic sphere or the feminization of particular activities, but rather it transcends the house. It's in the cornfields, it's in the forest. It's what generates this collective well-being that sustains the possibility of life. And that is central in a context of these death machines, of these narco state violence. So what I'd like to end with is how we're thinking of these 30 years of daily construction of sustaining a collective life existence, of a healthy relationship to the land, to the earth, of reterritorialization as central to the Zapatista movement. and how that comes into profound tension with the hyper masculinity of militarizations that's attached to organized crime, to the to the Mexican state's presence through the army. So how do you generate that cultivation of a collective life existence in front of the extreme violences that's being lived? That's the type of tensions that right now are being lived in the Zapatista territories, and it's not only in Zapatista communities or in Mexico. I think there's our tensions that we live in other places of the world and in Latin America, and hence the political relevance beyond Zapatista territory. And I will pass it back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Mariana. There's a lot in what you said that does lead us to that question of how is this relevant beyond Chiapas, and I want to try and build on what you said with some reflections on agrobiodiversity conservation, agroecology, and what's been happening over the past few years, and how some researchers have shown what I think is really important set of lessons for anyone interested in the future of our planet and the kinds of ways in which the Zapatista movement is operating right now. So I'll make some comments about these points on this slide and then conclude, and then we can open up for Q&A. So what we're referring to, I think both of us, is the importance of understanding autonomy as not only this resistance to models of development or models of political authority that are top-down or discriminatory or rooted in colonial histories and in exploitation, but also the building of something that is capable of creating alternative forms of interaction within communities, between communities and the rest of society, and with our natural environment too. I think that one of the things that's at the core of this is the realization that one of the factors that led to the uprising in Chiapas in the first place was the depletion of those resources by fairly unregulated or corruptly regulated businesses, including some of the ones that Mariana mentioned, the expansion of the cattle frontier in lowland jungle areas, which were not particularly apt to extensive ranching. We've seen this other parts of Latin America, of course, in the Amazon basin, which still is a big issue. When we think of autonomy then, and Mariana's mentioned this in other writings of hers, with broad brushstrokes, we can refer to two periods. One, in the case of Chiapas, from around 1994, from just after the rebellion occurring up until around 2006, which was this period in which the Zapatistas went about building these structures of autonomy to not rely on outside agencies to build their own projects in agriculture, health, education, women's participation, and justice in the communities. By 2003, that building effort had led to the creation of 5 regional autonomous governments in Zapatista territory that coexisted alongside the officially sanctioned governments institutions of Mexico and of Chiapas. And those 5 regional governments had within them around just over 30 autonomous municipalities that the Zapatistas govern according to this political initiative to create something that would be a strong alternative. I think since around 2006, while we've seen that effort continue, we've also seen the rise of what Mariana referred to now as narco state violence, the presence of criminal organizations, often in cahoots with authorities, or at least able to operate without intervention and therefore affecting community life up and down the country, including in the state of Chiapas, and particularly affecting indigenous communities where some of the trafficking organizations, drug traffickers, and cartels have targeted landholding for the production of certain drugs, certain routes that are used to traffic not only drugs, but also migrants from further south, from Central America, from Guatemala, across the border, and to attempt to take over local authority to support their own operations. So we've got at the same time this effort to build autonomy, to build these alternatives, to care for the land, particularly the milpa, which Mariana mentioned, and on that basis to create alternatives for meeting the health and educational and other needs of community members. But it's occurring within a context not only of officially a counterinsurgency, which has existed since 1994 through the military and the more kind of low-key efforts to wear down Zapatista communities, along now with the narco violence and its ability to operate. Mexican government's response to the narco violence has tended and still tends to be more focused on a militarized set of strategies. And this has also created extra problems. For example, in Chiapas, where the National Guard, which was created in this current administration, is completely under the control of the Mexican Ministry of Defense, and the building of a barracks, for example, right next to indigenous communities in the highlands of Chiapas, which are being rejected because of the lack of consent for the construction of those installations, and the fear that indigenous communities are just again being marginalized from this effort to try and bring greater autonomy. One of the things that I think has been also important, as Mariana said, for us to think about is that as the Zapatistas have tried to build their autonomy, but also defend it in the face of these aggressions, one of the things that continues to this day is how Zapatista communities managed the land which they were able to recuperate back in 1994. One of the most persistent forms of aggression against the Zapatistas hasn't come directly from the Mexican military, but has come from local organizations which are either allied with government political parties or are protected by well-placed politicians. And the Center for Human Rights, Fray Bartolomé de las Casas in Chiapas, has documented this for 30 years now and continues to do so. They have a report which was published last year, which really brings up to date some of the tactics used by these organizations to try and chip away at the land base of the Zapatistas and the communities where the Zapatistas have been able to build something of their autonomy. And those include such as cutting off Zapatista community members from access to basic services like water or electricity, from occupying land which the Zapatistas have been using since 1994 in their own production process, from attacking violently members of the Zapatista support bases who are not members of the Zapatista army per se, but are in support of the Zapatista movement, but are civilian members of the communities, of attacking some of the installations that the Zapatistas have built, such as storage houses for crops that the Zapatistas produce, coffee, for example, or for cooperatives that they have set up stores and so on that serve the community. So it's clear that there is this constant effort to try and wear down the Zapatistas and their ability to sustain their autonomy. Amidst all of this, we might think that they really don't have much of a chance. It's a very difficult environment that's not very conducive to building these kinds of new relationships that Mariana has referred to, of greater respect for the land, for the health of the milpa, the cornfields, of the kinds of social and cultural relationships which come out of a more stable set of those relationships. At the end of 2023, then, to mark also what was coming up to the 30th anniversary of the uprising, the Zapatistas issued a set of communiques in November and December, in one way to say to the world, we are still here, we're still building this. They reflected on recent initiatives of the Zapatistas, such as in 2021, a tour or a visit to Europe to meet with social movements in Spain, Italy, and other parts of Europe, who are also concerned with the state of the planet, the politics of the world today, and to forge together a common sense that there are possible futures if we know about them and if we work together. So the Zapatistas haven't been just stuck in their communities, as it were, battling at these local adversaries. They've also been able to build a national network and a global network of solidarity and support. And one of the main proposals that came out at the end of 2023 was to say, okay, if there's all this dispute over some areas of the land in Chiapas, we propose to make some of it what we're going to call non-property, in which case the communities that are close by who need also access to land can use the land without becoming owners of that land, but enter into agreements with Zapatista communities. That has the potential, I think, to reduce some of the tension in the region that has been exploited politically by outside actors to try and wear down the Zapatistas as an alternative political force. We'll see how that goes. Within this, though, there's one, I think, really good example of the possibilities for a greater understanding between those who are with the Zapatista movement and those who may sympathize with the Zapatistas but are not part of the movement in Chiapas. For example, whether a small farmer is a Zapatista supporter or not, they equally face threats to their livelihood because of things like climate change or the imposition of technological packages for agricultural development in which chemicals or genetically modified seeds play a central role or potentially will. So beyond the Zapatista movement itself, there are a variety of other rural social movements and non-governmental organizations and researchers who've been active in a movement to support an agroecological approach to rural development. The Zapatistas have participated in that, and there's some interesting research, and I include it in the references to this set of slides, which I can share with you. Carol Hernandez, for example, researcher at UNAM, and Peter Rosset at El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, and others have looked at this closely and found that for many community members, land isn't simply an economic resource about which to make decisions solely on the basis of commerce and trade and inputs and outputs, but it has a centrality in the struggle for that sense of autonomy, of the ability to direct the community's future and to resist the various outside pressures, such as the narco-state violence that Mariana mentioned, or extractivist projects of unregulated projects in the mining industry is a very big problem in the region as well, of course. So I think what the Zapatistas have done is to, by being able to gain that material base of land back in 1994 and to hold on to it and to build on that basis a variety of projects in agriculture, in health, in education, in women's rights and participation, in the community level decisions around governance and justice and so on. They have said that, you know, what currently is facing us is actually facing all of the world. When we look around the planet today, there is such destruction of our environment from the development policies which are occurring, but also from militarization, from war, I think this is fairly clear whenever we just look at the news, wherever in the world we're looking at. And what needs to happen is a struggle for life, which goes way beyond a community or two in the rural areas of Chiapas. And as Mariana said, goes way beyond 1994 and the conditions that gave rise to the rebellion at that point, although some were also part of that. But I think our current moment obliges us to reflect on what that future is going to look like if we don't have something like what the Zapatistas are doing and not just proposing. I'll finish on this point that for some theorists and writers and scholars of our current condition, I think there's a fairly common theme. What Boaventura de Sousa Santos wrote about in the 2000s, he says that we need to broaden our understanding of the present. We often have a very homogeneous understanding of what the tools are to deal with the issues that we face. I think we're in a moment where the tools that we've inherited from previous decades and theories of development are showing themselves to be becoming very short. So by broadening the present, we bring in more voices and more possibilities, and we don't waste those opportunities. And in doing so, we're also taking care of the future, in his argument. I think we often have become somewhat complacent that the future is always going to be this path towards prosperity, progress, security, all of these things which we still see in government documents and international aid, official government international aid rhetoric, narratives. But I think what we're seeing here is a movement that has seen what happens when we have marginalized voices in the present and when we do not look to take care of our collective future. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Dr. Mora and Dr. Harvey, for an excellent, both excellent ideas and presentations, and a lot to think about here. I have several several questions of my own, but there's several questions already here in the Q&A. So I'll just start with some of them. An anonymous attendee asks, do you know of any cases of the ECLN fighting the organized crime groups that are infringing upon their territory?
David, can you repeat that? It cut out for a second.
Oh, sorry. Do you know of any cases of the EZLN fighting the organized crime groups that are infringing upon their territory?
Do you want Neil and I to read the questions? And then we can take turns answering?
Yeah,
Yeah?
either one of you can answer, yes.
Okay. Do you want to answer, Neil? Do you want me to? Oh.
Go ahead. I've got some ideas about it, but I'll let you go.
Well, if you have some ideas about it, I'll hand it over to you then.
Okay. Directly, no. I think what's really important to know about the Zapatistas is that they've politically taken the decision not to be drawn into this armed conflict that the cartels are engaged in amongst themselves and against community members who they're seeking to enlist in their operations. One of the ways in which the Zapatistas have done this over the years, I think early on, prior to the rise of the cartels in Chiapas, which is relatively recent compared to northern Mexico, was for the autonomous communities of the Zapatistas to firmly establish some rules about how the land is used and the presence of people coming in and out of the communities using the infrastructure of the communities. And they said fairly early on that no production of drugs or trafficking of drugs would be allowed in the autonomous communities. So in some way, they created their own restrictions And that has had some, I think, important effect in sending that message that their territories are governed more closely because they have a political project to build autonomy rather than be at the mercy of traffickers and local politicians or higher level politicians who may protect them. So I think they've been quite successful in avoiding getting dragged into that. However, recently, since 2020, I think since really the pandemic hit, there's been the rise of conflict, armed and violent conflict between two cartels, the Sinaloa cartel, which traditionally was the only major cartel in Chiapas until that period, and then the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which arrived around then. And in some municipalities, particularly right on the border with Guatemala, Frontera Comalapa, for example, many community members have been forcibly displaced by the cartels, and really the inability or unwillingness of government responses to that issue. So I think the Zapatistas are keeping a close eye on that, of course, but as far as I can see, they haven't been directly in conflict in that way. And if I could just bring up my little PowerPoint again, I'll show you a slide which I didn't get to, but I think kind of illustrates what we're talking about. Sorry. So this is posted at the entrance of one of the Zapatista autonomous communities in the highlands of Chiapas. And I'll translate it into English. It says, "Welcome to the rebel autonomous municipality of Zapatista municipality of San Pedro Polo, Chiapas. In this municipality, it is prohibited to consume marijuana and other drugs. It is prohibited to buy and sell stolen cars. It is prohibited to buy and sell alcohol. Here, the people is in charge and the government obeys." So that's the part of the very rudimentary infrastructure, as you can see, a bit rusty, but that is the message that I think they've been able to project. Mariana.
Yes, I think to add some things to what Neil is saying, I think that the answer to the question is obviously no, there hasn't a response, but I think it's important to think how have the Zapatista communities and the political military structure that's still present of the EZLN, how have they responded to attacks, to antagonisms in the past, and there has been in general an agreement of non-response, So if non-Zapatista peasant organizations locally try to take back or try to take land that's of the Zapatista communities, there's been an emphasis not on retaliating violently, but rather setting a space of negotiation. So for example, having the juntas de buen gobierno negotiate and figure out ways of resolving those types of situations and to not respond with physical violence. And that's been the trajectory throughout all of these years. Now, I think that it's very important to recognize that the organized crime are not antagonistic, semi-paramilitarized organizations at the local level. No, we're talking about transnational networks that have drones, that with infrared heat sensors that act on a whole other level. And so I think that here, rather than having a straightforward answer, I think it's important to recognize the magnitude of what's at play. There's an affirmation and an insistence to defend historical Mayan territories that are under rebel army control and of their communities. And how do you do that when the attacks are getting progressively more violent? How do you do that in non-violent kind of ways? So those are the types of discussions that are being had. When I was at the anniversary on January 1st, I was talking to some Zapatista support bases, and they were saying that really deep in the jungle, not in Zapatista communities, but next to them, there was horses that were that all of a sudden would come back to the house of their owner, and in the bags, the costales on each side were heads, of people that had been assassinated. So those are very clear messages. What do you do in a nonviolent way against that type of extreme violence? And so I think that that's sort of related to what Richard was asking. I'm trying to see how we can put together the different responses to the questions to what Richard was asking in terms of the sort of the decentralization in Zapatista autonomy currently, and what's the impulse behind that. And I don't necessarily have an answer because I don't know what's being discussed on the ground. But it seems to me that there's been an emphasis in the anniversary. There was very little talk about autonomy, that in fact, autonomy as a concept wasn't used very much. It was el común, not lo común, el común, as a concept, the common, or that which is common. And I find that really important politically, because if you think about autonomy, you're always asking autonomy in relationship to what and in relationship to whom, and that immediately conjures up the image of the state. It's autonomy in relationship to state institutions. It's autonomy to the logics of capital. But el común isn't interpolating another actor. It's interpolating other actors at the margins of the state. It doesn't conjure up the image of the state. It conjures up, how do you create alliances that sustain a sense of the commons, of that which is common, on the outskirts of the state. And so if I think about that, and to partially answer your question, Richard, I would say that that's a fundamental shift that I find really powerful. And I understand that to be an invitation to thread together alliances in a much more systematic manner, with a disregard to the state institutions, which has been historical tendency of the EZLN. How you do that? In the anniversary, there was a lot of talk of that the only way we're going to be able to control organized crime is by joining together as communities, and to work with our youth so they are not tempted to join those organized criminal organizations. Because there's a level of violence that gets unleashed that spirals very quickly out of control. I can pass it on. I have written down all of the questions, but I'm not sure. Neil, do you want to take up another question, and then I can address them?
And for our audience, the question that Dr. Richard Stahler-Schock posed was, what do you see as the main factors behind the recent decision to decentralize the self-governing autonomous structures and replace them with communal property on the recovered lands with non-property, right? And so that was a really interesting answer, Dr. Mora. Neil, if you have anything to add to that, you can add it. If not, we can move to the next set of questions. And you're muted, sorry.
Sure, let's move on to another question. I'm just bringing them up now. Sorry, I was looking in the wrong place. And I was wondering, how did Mariana get all these questions? But that's fine with me if you want to answer all the questions.
So the next question that I have here from Alejo Stark is, one of the key recent encuentros that has not received much scholarly attention has been the CIESAS in 2017 and 2018. An encuentro with scientists from all over the world, which I believe was unfortunately cut short in the wake of 2020 pandemic. Excuse me. What do you both make of the Zapatista project for autonomy and the ways in which the Zapatistas are forging alliances with scientists? What does it say about how the Zapatistas conceive the emancipatory potential of the sciences and their critique of widespread pseudoscientific thought within the left?
Okay, I'm not sure about the left there, but I'll try and answer what I know of that. I think it was a very important initiative to show that the Zapatistas, as in I think it's been the case all over these decades since 1994, have been very open to learning from other people throughout Mexico and internationally who have an interest in learning from the Zapatistas to try and create these spaces for dialogue and mutual learning in ways that could directly benefit their efforts, for example, in agroecology. I think that is a really key area in which there's been great advances in the scientific realm, which have critiqued, some of the more reductionist notions of science and have pushed back against, I think, the corporate control of much of science in agricultural development, but have used scientific knowledge to work with Zapatistas and create this space in which each side can contribute and benefit. So I think it was a really important initiative. It came at the same time as another project with the arts. There was a whole series of encuentros as well to promote exchange of artistic work from Zapatista communities and from other communities in Mexico and internationally. And I think one of the things that has just been mentioned there in the question, Alejo, was how the pandemic kind of cut short some of that effort. I think that's true. But one of the things I thought was really interesting when you look at what happened during the pandemic, there's a ton of misinformation everywhere, right? Not just in Mexico or in Chiapas, but there was a lot of misinformation. The Zapatistas, I think, because they'd been building their own health projects since 1994 and had worked closely with health professionals in solidarity with the movement, with non-governmental organizations locally, they were able, I think, fairly early on to make sure that the pandemic did not spread so widely within the Zapatistas communities as appeared to be the case elsewhere. So they took the measures, they took the science seriously, while the government's response was very either slow or very confusing. And there's some writings on this, which I'd be glad to share with you all. But I think that shows that the Zapatistas are not closed off to scientists and researchers. What they are critical of, I think with some good reason, is this sense that only scientific experts know best and that they can provide all of the answers. So if people are willing to engage in a dialogue, I think there's a lot of possibilities there in the health area, in education, certainly in agroecology. Thank you for your question.
If I can add to what Neil said, Alejo, I was in I participated in the 2018 Conciencia, and I think that I one of the things I always admire is sort of the Zapatista play on words, no, and that and invites us to pause, no. Conciencia is obviously a double. No, it's with science and conciencia as in consciousness. And I think consciousness not in the sense like consciousness and science understood in a much broader sense, and we tend to understand it. So conciencia, like the collective understanding of oneself in time and space, and a critical engagement with that knowledge in a way that it alters political and amplifies the capacity for political action, no? And conciencia with science, understanding that science in not the social scientists or the natural science, not within sort of Western notions of science, but that the idea that there's a critical sense of steps that allow you to interrogate a phenomenon and then find solutions. No, so I think that both those things are at play in conciencia. So it's the assumption that if we can decentralize the expert knowledge and put these different knowledges in dialogue, we're going to collectively understand ourselves in time and space differently, and that's going to generate other possibilities of collective action. No, so I think that that's a central element, and I think that it's situated. I always like to think of Zapatista. Sort of to get back on this grandness of the Zapatismo, not because it's unique, but rather because it's resonating with other social movements. No? And so it's not that that they came up and coined this term and sort of branded this way of political action, but rather they've been able to capture a historical moment and they resonate with them. And so this idea of conciencia, I think, forms part of a whole series of alternative epistemological moves that have been central to social movements throughout Latin America and other parts of the world to rethink putting knowledges together differently and decentering a particular dominant knowledge. That's something that we see characteristic of other social movements as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Christine Ever, Dr. Ever asks, this is specifically to Mariana. Mariana, can you speak about your views of the influence of the Zapatista movement's focus on women's rights within base communities and the broader society?
Thank you, Christine. It's nice to know that you're listening. There's several people whose work I've read consistently, and so I wish we had more of a space of dialogue.
Me too. There's people
yes.
here that I use their books in my classes.
Me too.
So.
Yes. I hope we have more of another type of webinar where we can actually see each other, even if it's on a screen and dialogue. I'm going to sort of switch the question because I think that there's been a lot of emphasis on how the Zapatista movement, the influence of women's rights in the communities. And there's been less emphasis placed on the way that women's participation, both in the political military structure and in the support bases, how their ongoing participation has altered and transformed the way that autonomy is conceived and enacted. No, and I think about that because I think that there's a silencing of histories that at some point need to be unearthed. And I'm thinking of Rosa Luz Perez's doctoral dissertation, which is a beautiful dissertation. She focuses on two political military women leaders, on Ana Maria and Maribel. And she focuses on how Ana Maria and Maribel's history, life histories, informed strategic decisions that they've implemented within Zapatista territory. No, so for example, Ana Maria, her history, her parents' history of struggling against the landowners and taking and reoccupying land, and how some of those strategies when she was the political military authority for during the armed uprising, she was in charge of San Cristobal, no? So one of the main towns. She was the head military leader for that. And then later on in things that happened in the highlands, she made political decisions based on that history that she had with her parents in peasant organizations. And that became part of, like, when the women defended the communities and the men fled to the mountains, part of that undoing was Ana Maria's decisions. Maribel was in charge, was a political military leader that was in charge of what's the Caracol Cuatro, like the region of Altamirano. And she grew up on lands that had already been claimed. So it was sort of newfounded lands way before the uprising. And the central element in those lands was, how are we going to make decisions collectively, and the focus on health and education. In the Caracol Cuatro, in that whole region, the central points of autonomy, as I expressed in my talk, was health, education, and agroecology. And that had to do with Maribel's participation. So I feel like, and that's just two examples, I feel like that there's that history of women's involvement and how from their gendered roles have been participating in 30 years, and how autonomy, we can't understand it without their influences. So I would sort of switch the question to talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Here's another general question from Isaac Garza. What is the vision that the Zapatistas have of the migrants crossing Chiapas? How can this tension between the state and cartels in the region be translated into the migration coming from Central and South America?
Hi, Isaac. Great to know you're here too, virtually. Look forward to seeing you soon. I think the Zapatistas have made several points in their publications and their communiques in defense of the rights of migrants. They know why people are migrating. It's often due to the conditions that they see very close at hand to themselves. Militarization, narco violence, poverty, of course, lack of opportunities, but also this increasingly, I think, important, the impacts of the way that criminal organizations act with impunity as they traffic people, and the way that government authorities have cracked down, often violently, on protests by migrants. I recall I think it was the fall of 2022 or 2023, in Tapachula, on the border between Chiapas and Guatemala on the Chiapas side, there's a large number of migrants who've been more or less trapped there in a kind of indefinite way, waiting for papers, humanitarian visas and such that would allow them to find work or to continue their journey within or beyond Chiapas. And some of the caravans that have organized from Tapachula and have started to demonstrate and march towards Mexico City to try and bring this issue to light and gain some redress, have been quite violently attacked by law enforcement, National Guard officials, the Mexican immigration officials, and so on. And there's plenty of coverage of this in the media and video. And I recall the Zapatistas pointing this out as, or denouncing it as, aggression against the rights of those migrants, and another indication of the failure of migration policies, not just in Mexico, but more broadly. So I think they would see this issue as something quite close to heart. It's another instance of the need for change. With their own community members also, many have also migrated, often within Mexico, to find seasonal employment and then return to their communities. So they're very familiar with what migration involves and the exploitation of migrants within and beyond Mexico. And I think that's where, these two issues may find that they come together, that the rebellion in 1994 did occur in a state on the border with Guatemala. At that point, there wasn't the level of migration to the north as we're seeing right now. But I think there's, I guess, a common cause in thinking about the future. Again, if we come back to this question of what do we need to build for a future for everybody, a world in which many worlds fit, is the Zapatista expression. Where do migrants fit in that? Are they simply also reduced to the category of servitude that Mariana mentioned has been historically the case for indigenous peoples in Mexico and in Chiapas? Thank you for your question.
Yeah, and I think what Neil says is really key, and I think it takes us back to understanding autonomy, that it's not autonomy for Tzotzil, Tojolabal, and Chol peoples, no? It's or El Común, no? To think about the El Común as this creation of alliances. It's rather, okay, if you're going to be in our territory, And this is part of the discussion around settler colonialism in the United States and other places. No, it's not. And I think their position is that it's not that you can't come into our territory, it's under which ethical, political sets of relationships can we be hosts to you in our territory, no? And I think that that's a very different type of shift. And I think it's important to recognize that it's the border with Guatemala. Those communities have seen the Guatemalan refugees, and it's not the first time that there's migrants passing through that are fleeing. I remember in the 90s that there was in the autonomous communities, Guatemalan ex-refugees that are now living in Mexico, that they were marrying within the communities and they were incorporated into the communities. So it's under what sets of agreements and under what conditions of political ethical respect do people pass? Do people stay the time that they need to? Do they find refuge? And as Neil said, it's part of the types of critiques of racialized capitalism that the Zapatistas are critiquing at a global scale.
Thank you. This is, we've actually gone over the time, and I thank you both, and thank you everyone in our audience for staying a little longer. This will be the last question that I ask you, and I will stop taxing your time. I'm sorry. But thank you for answering all the questions of our audience. This is from Hanifi Baris, Dr. Baris. Thank you very much, Mariana and Neil, for this thought-provoking conversation. Can you comment on how the indigenous democracy implemented, observed in Chiapas contributes to their alternative policies in economic and political life, such as gender and economic equality, prioritizing ecological balance rather than development or growth, etc.? Because neither leftist nor liberal democracies are known for what have been prioritized by the Zapatistas, as Mariana noted in her comments. We will be going too far if we say that there is an indigenous democratic universality emerging, revived by the Zapatistas, and that this democratic universality is a completely different one from the liberal Eurocentric models with their concepts, values, and institutions? That's a question right there.
Wow. Well, in the couple of minutes that we have, no, seriously, if anyone wants to follow up with either of us, let me give you my email. It's nharvey@nmsu.edu. We'd be glad to follow up and share, for example, some of the readings that we're referring to or other links. But I think it's a really important question, and perhaps the question to end on is, what does this mean more broadly politically in terms of alternative approaches to democracy? I think was one of the key words in that question. Thank you. I would tend to agree that some of the older interpretations of democracy have been in need of critique and have been critiqued over the past 30-odd years. And the Zapatista critique is one of those. And I think it's a really important one. One of the problems that some critics have said of the Zapatistas is that, oh, yeah, this is all interesting, but it's them alone, it's their communities, and it could only really come from where they are. And we really need, for example, to, I think the word in the question as well was to universalize, or how do you make such efforts more broadly applicable, the defense of indigenous rights, for example. And one approach has been to turn to exactly what was mentioned, the state, the liberal theory of the state as the protector, the ultimate guarantor of individual and now indigenous rights, being included into the Mexican Constitution and so on. I think there are, many people who would say that that is the way to go. That would be an important step, and it's happened in other Latin American countries. But there's also problems with that. One of the things is that universalization often comes with a more homogenized view of democracy and of rights, and tends to strengthen state institutions rather than particularly indigenous people, indigenous communities and their aspirations. So it can be a new form of co-optation, just as Zapata's demands for land and liberty were co-opted by the PRI and the corporatist associations that we mentioned at the start. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that what we're talking about could be, and perhaps in some cases is already being co-opted by state institutions with the roots in European political thought, in which, for example, private property is an uncontested principle. And what we've seen here, I think, is that at least for the Zapatistas and the supporters, that principle is also being historicized. People are asking, how did that come to be? And look at all of the turmoil it can cause when we have such violence and conflict over land. So a different relationship to our world and to our land is vital to keep reflecting on as a possibility for that relationship. And I think things can be broadly shared, but without it all becoming somewhat centralized. The Zapatistas have said, we're not trying to impose our model on anyone else. We have what we have. It's our modo. Nuestros modos y principios son nuestros. And we know they're very particular, and we don't have all the answers, but we'd be sure happy to have some kind of conversations with those who feel that we need a way out of our current situation. Mariana?
No, I don't think I have anything more to add. I think I would just end maybe with a question of it seems like democracy as a concept, no? I'm wondering if does that get to, even if it's participatory and goes beyond these notions of development, is the notions of non-property processes of reterritorialization, of reestablishing a connection across socio-natural geographies. If incorporating other ontologies and multiple epistemologies and putting them in dialogue, of understanding political participation as a pedagogical component where new knowledge is produced as part of the discussion that enables other forms of action. If all of those elements that I consider fundamental to Zapatismo, if that gets encapsulated within the idea of democracy, or is democracy as a concept too restrictive, and rather perhaps we're talking about other forms of notions of radical political imaginaries that can't be reducible to democracy as a term.
Thank you both. I actually unblurred my screen because in my office I have 3 Zapatista posters from the Primer Encuentro Against Impunity, Contra la Impunidad, where I was at the time in 2009. So very apropos for today's talk. Since we've run out of time, I just want to thank you both, Neil, Mariana. You have been wonderful speakers, and thank you for giving us not only a little bit of a historical background for those who are not as attuned into the Zapatismo, but also what is happening now 30 years from the beginning of the movement to, and what is the view of the future, which is very interesting, right? Still very rooted in what started 30 years ago, but also visionary still with a little bit of kind of more modifications towards the future. So it's been very enlightening, and I thank you. As for myself, it was great to see you both. Mariana, it was a pleasure seeing you and hearing you after all these years. Hopefully we'll get to see each other in person soon. But thank you, Dr. Harvey. Thank you, Dr. Mora. Thank you, everyone. Gracias a todos los que participaron. Thank you, everyone that participated in today's discussion. It was a pleasure. This actually closes our speaker series for this year in CLABS, in the Center for Latin American and Border Studies here at NMSU. I will let both Dr. Harvey and Dr. Mora not only close out the conversation. I also want to point out that Dr. Mora posted both Dr. Harvey's and her own emails in the question and answer session, so that you can actually have both of those emails in case you want to email them directly and continue some of these conversations. And Harvey at NMSU and marab@gmail.com. So please don't hesitate to do that. This is why we do this speaker series too. So hopefully we can kind of put people together, ideas together, and then continue growing in our knowledge and communities. Again, thank you all for participating. Gracias a todos. Neil, Mariana, thank you so much. I leave you to close us out.
No, thank you very much, David, Marta, Neil, for the invitation, for organizing, for facilitating the conversation. And please, yes, I do hope we have a chance to maybe having another conversation, but with everyone else that just writes their questions. But I'd like to be able to have a dialogue, even if it's virtual. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, David, Martha, for organizing this and the whole series this semester. And we look forward to more in the fall and spring of next year. Thanks, everybody, for logging in and being present today and your questions. And we hope to follow up if we weren't able to answer everything. Hopefully we can do that in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Finally, before we leave, I want to thank, this is a collective effort, right? So it is not only me and Marta, Dr. Berta Bermudez Tapia, Dr. Neil Harvey, Dr. Christopher Brown, myself and Marta this year were the organizers of this year's speaker series. So thank you all. We're indebted to you and the work you have done to bring us all the speakers. See you next year. Hasta luego.